And he claimed the land just to the east of the Kirkwood land. And that land you guys know because it's where Wheatland is, and it's where the town of Hopewell is. And that was the Matheny property. And he and his brother Daniel actually established a ferry that we now know as the Wheatland Ferry.
Good afternoon. Hello. Welcome and thank you. Please keep munching on your delicious lunch while I talk. As usual, I have nothing good to say. I am Zach Geary, current president of McMinnville City Club. Thank you very much for coming to our November 2017 program with Jim Gullo. Before we get started, I got a couple announcements. First off, I'd like to thank all the sponsors that help us make this run. In the gold category, we have Larson Motors, Schmekeda Community College, Western Title and Escrow, McMinnville Area Chamber of Commerce, Columbia Bank, On Point Community Credit Union, First Federal Savings, Gormley Plumbing and Mechanical, and Cellar Ridge Construction. In the silver category, we have First American Title Insurance, Payne West Insurance, Hillside Retirement Communities, News Register, Sokol Blosser Winery, and Willamette West Realtors. And in the Cultural Trust, we have Stephen Rupp, Phil and Phoebe Newman, Jeb and Michelle Bladine, Dan and Mary Corrigan, and Richard Ulrich. And if you see any of the sponsors out in your day-to-day life, make sure to thank them for their support of City Club and don't tell them we got Jim Gullo here and it's part of something they sponsored. So we're going to take next month off from our normal luncheon program, just as a reminder for Christmas break, as we usually do, and then we'll be back at it in January with a strong 6 months of programs. And just to remind you what they are, and to remind you to remind a friend and bring a friend. In January, we have Andrea Payne and Beth Downs and Robin Mukunda presenting on North Cyprus, Turkey, and the Middle East in Flux, the ebb and flow of history. Very exciting. In February, we'll have Jeff Knapp come and talk on leveraging tourism for economic growth. And he's the executive director of Visit McMinnville. We'll have in March Susan Saladoff presenting on her documentary Hot Coffee, Is Justice Being Served? I just watched that film. Thank you, Chuck. It's very, very depressing. April, William Sullivan, local author and sort of a Jim Gullo light. William Sullivan, D.B. Cooper, and the Exploding Whale, Folk Heroes of Oregon. He writes a lot of hiking books and kind of local area myth books. It's very great. And Maria Stewart, IPNC and in McMinnville. And in June, we'll close it out with Dr. Chad Tilburg on observed and predicted consequences of a warming world. Also, in December, we'll have our next pub chat, the third Tuesday, December 19th. The topic is still being confirmed, but as soon as we have that confirmed, we'll get that for you. But mark your calendars, we'll have a pub chat December 19th. And without further ado, I'd like to bring up today's speaker, local author Jim Gullo, to talk on his project, Before There Were Grapes.
Thank you, Dr. Geary. Thank you, City Club, for having me. I am a writer and that most awful of things, a journalist here in town. Lock him up, lock him up. About 2.5 years ago, I got approached by Ken Wright, who's very interested in history. And he had a unique proposition for me. He wanted me to research and write reports about the histories of the 13 vineyards from which he sources. A couple of which he owns, many he has long-term leases on. And I thought, well, what do you mean? You know, we know when people planted the grapes. That's 50-some years ago and at the very outside. But no, he wanted to go deeper than that. He said, what happened on the land that these vineyards occupy? I want to know. I want to know who the people were. And that was a bit of a daunting proposition. I wasn't sure if I could find anything. But I started looking into it, and I ended up writing 13 different reports for Ken, all of which are on his website, and then I've gone on and done others for other wineries. So I'm going to kind of summarize what came of that, and it his vineyards kind of make a circle around this whole valley, from Dundee and Yamhill, Carlton down to Eola Hills and even down by Dallas and Monmouth. So we get a nice kind of snapshot of this settlement of this area. But first, I'm going to read you an interesting story, as the 1910 Oregon Daily Journal put it in this classified ad. See if any of this strikes a note with you. Now is coming the time when you are thinking of that little fruit farm where you can have plenty of fruit to use and sell. Have your fresh Jersey cow with plenty of cream, milk, and butter, and cackling hens laying 50-cent eggs, and raising everything in your garden, and be independent. We have just such a place in a 25-acre Willamette Valley farm. All the best of rolling land, 19 acres of bearing orchard, 6 acres in cultivation, balance in brush and pasture, old buildings, only 1 mile of railroad station, 4 miles of good town of 6,000 people. Might trade it for unencumbered Portland property. And that was a come on that is still kind of being used now, isn't it, to try to lure city people to come out and capture that country dream. Well, this is Elton and Peggy Ingram, who did capture that country dream. And on August 30th, 1956, the Salem Statesman Journal newspaper ran a little item in the middle of page 11. Mr. and Mrs. Elton Ingram of Amity have purchased the L.A. Courtemanche farm and are planning to move there soon. This is Elton, and Florine was her name, but she went by Peggy her whole life. On their wedding day in 1939, she's 18, he's 28. She was born in Forest Grove, and her mom died when she was, I think, 5 years old, so she was raised by her aunt and uncle, and he was a young man in Southern Oregon who went gold mining and logging and rode the rails and built houses and decided to be a farmer. And they owned one other farm in Amity before they bought this property in 1956. From that date, it would take them 27 years, to 1983, when their daughter, Betty O'Brien, would talk them into just trying some grapes. Just try some grapes over on the side there. And it took them years, actually, to talk Elton into allowing that abomination on his nice working farm. Elton and Peggy would live the rest of their lives on that farm, on that property, which is now the Elton Vineyard. It's just down by Hopewell. We see it when we drive down to Salem. And their ashes are interred on it, on a nice granite memorial that Betty and her brother built. But that's not the story of the Elton Vineyard. It goes back, of course, much further. We meet Joseph and Lucy Ann Kirkwood. And save for Native American tribes, which are very hard to document around here, we will call these the original owners of that property. In 1849, 107 years before the Ingrams got to it, Joseph Kirkwood, who was born in Scotland in 1820, was 25 years old, single, set out from St. Joseph, Missouri in May of 1845. He was in a company that had 223 wagons, 954 people, and 9,425 cattle that were pushed across the plains. A lot of them were headed to gold mine in California, but Joseph split off, came up to Oregon. He'd been a Mississippi River boatman after he got here from Scotland, and he wound up there in Hopewell, just outside of the little town of Hopewell. And he claimed that property as his farm and his homestead. 2 years earlier, his wife-to-be, her whole name was Louisiana Catherine Matheny. She had just passed her 14th birthday, and she crossed the plains with her family of 8. She was born in Indiana. Her father, Henry Matheny, reminds me of Zach Geary. He had a strange medical condition where he would suddenly kind of go blank and wander off for days and come to and not know where he was or what happened. and the family would have to go out and find him. And this apparently happened several times. And in fact, it got him out of the war because Henry was unfit for duty. You never knew where he was going to end up. Anyway, he came over and he claimed the land just to the east of the Kirkwood land. And that land you guys know because it's where Wheatland is, and it's where the town of Hopewell is. And that was the Matheny property. And he and his brother Daniel actually established the ferry that we now know as the Wheatland Ferry across the river in the 1840s. Henry did not last long here. After 5 years after he came to Oregon, he wandered off to California to make his fortune in gold and never returned, died of fever there. So Lucienne was 18 years old. She married Joseph in 1847, and they lived on that land for 60 years. She died in 1909. He died in 1912 at the age of 92. They had 9 children. Not much is known or said about them. He was the largest taxpayer in Yamhill County in those days. He built a threshing machine that won prizes at the Oregon State Fair. And he and Lucienne are buried in Hopewell. Well, so 1912 was Joseph's passing, and if we can imagine history a little bit, 20 years go by, nothing happens. That land has been fallow and vacant and overgrowing with everything that grows around here. And in 1931, we see another newspaper clipping. This one, the one on the left, Valley Farmland. This one was a clip from 1931. The Joseph Kirkwood property that has been fallow and vacant in disrepair is purchased by a Louis A. Courtemanche. Anybody here, does that name ring a bell at all? Yeah, okay. So Courtemanches were local businessmen. They owned the hardware store here in McMinnville. He was on the Water and Light Board and announced kind of that he just bought the farm as an investment property maybe, or just to cultivate it. He was going to hire somebody and work the land there. His store actually in McMinnville burned down in the 40s, and he and his son went on to start very successful heavy equipment rental businesses. Anyway, so it's now 25 years later. Elton and Peggy Ingram buy the property in the mid-50s, start cultivating their land and raising their 2 kids. Elton hit on maybe one of the first boom crops, or one of many boom crops. He started growing black cap raspberries, and a new product called Dr. Pepper desperately needed black cap raspberries to flavor their product that was going national. And Elton actually supplied them with the bulk of their fruit. And according to Betty O'Brien, that business kind of paid for the farm, paid off the farm. As I said, it took Betty and her husband Dick O'Brien years and years to talk Elton into letting them grow grapes. The grapes did fairly well, and they got bigger and bigger, and now the Elton Vineyard is 100 acres of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and it's very successful, one of the better or bigger vineyards around here. And Willamette Valley Vineyards and Jim Gullo entered into an agreement to lease all of the fruit and also to have the rights to purchase the property. And the vineyard kind of claimed one more person as we talk about the lineage of this. Dick O'Brien, Betty's husband, who was a school teacher in Salem and really pushed to start this vineyard property, saw the planting of the vineyard and the sale to Willamette Valley Vineyards, and they announced a year and a half ago that they're going to create a winery on the property and call it the Elton Winery. Dick died suddenly after a cancer diagnosis, claimed him within 2 or 3 months, and his ashes too are interred there at the Elton Vineyard. All right, so this is Ken Wright and Dick Daniel. We're moving just across the hill from the Elton Vineyard, back on the other side of the hill, and this is a Canary Hill vineyard that Dick Daniel and his wife Nancy planted in the early 80s. And when I interviewed Nancy Daniel, she said the best thing. She said, "We wanted to grow something, but we didn't know spit about growing grapes." but they grew grapes nevertheless. That property comes with a nice backstory. In 1844, Alva Compton Riggs Shaw decided, this is, mind you, a year after the Oregon Territorial Government was established at Champoeg. And Alva was the stepson of Joshua Shaw, who was so accomplished at something that his nickname was Sheep Shaw. Born in 1795, this is Alva born in 1816 in New York. They drove successfully the first sheep across the plains to make it to Oregon without being eaten by either the wolves or the other pioneers, and landed them on the property that's the Canary Hill Vineyard in the Eola Hills there. And I gather that you had a warden here at your last talk. Well, Alva beats him a little bit. In 1865, 20 years after arriving here, Alva was tasked with creating a prison in the Salem area. And he selected the site, which is now where the Western State Hospital is, and he built his prison, and he was tasked with moving the prisoners from Portland down there, which he did successfully, barely, because within a year they revolted and had a big prison riot, and he barely escaped with his life, and then promptly got out of town and moved to Berkeley with his wife. Before he left, though, he founded a town in the Eola Hills. And you guys probably know there's one town of any size in the Eola Hills. We call it Eola. Alva Shaw called it Cincinnati. And I don't know why it didn't stick. He was married to Sarah McNary Shaw, and this is her obituary from California, which I found on an old newspaper site. Another great story of pioneer grit. She came here with her family in 1845. Her father, Hugh, planted the first peach orchard in Polk County. She, when the Indian uprisings happened, she sewed the first flag that Oregonians took into battle, and had a good long life. Described here as a sterling pioneer woman of the early Oregon Territory days. A little sheep postscript, 100 years after these two occupied that land, the Primus, I think it's Primus, it might be Primus family of Salem, bought and owned that property and farmed and ranched it for many, many years. Clarence Primus, 1974 Polk County Livestockman of the Year. His farm by that point was 700 acres. He had 135 ewes. He had grains and ryegrass and seed and oats growing up there on the hills. And of course, he didn't have any grapes. And when Dick and Nancy Daniel bought that property and said, yeah, we're going to grow grapes, the farmers snickered and thought they were nuts and told him they were idiots for even attempting such a stupid thing. Charles McNary, many of you may have heard of. You've certainly heard of McNary Airport in Salem, and there's a little village called McNary. He was distantly related to Sarah McNary Shaw. And just a little odd historical postscript. He was a senator here for many years, and he was Wendell Willkie's running mate in the 1940 presidential election. When Dick and Nancy Daniel sold their now quite successful vineyard to Ken Wright, they ended up retiring to a golf course community outside of Salem that the property was given to this Charles McNary as a wedding gift by his father-in-law 50, 60, 80 years ago, earlier. And it's called Canary Hill Vineyard because, when Dick and Nancy planted it, there were all these beautiful yellow birds flying around, and they said, these are wonderful, we're going to name it Canary Hill after the canaries, and they found out a couple years later they were western goldfinches. The Freedom Hill Vineyard is a little bit farther west and south. It's just outside of Monmouth and Dallas, kind of in between the two. Beautiful vineyard, planted about the same time as the Canary Hill Vineyard in the 80s and has become quite successful. And with it comes even more harrowing pioneer story. Andrew Jackson Gilliam came across he was born in Missouri in 1818. In 1847, he left He left Missouri with his wife Sarah and 3 children under the age of 7. They had 30 sheep, they had 2 milk cows, and a team of oxen. And they had just the most awful crossing of the plains. I gather by 1847, 3 or 4 years into this migration, things got a lot more rocky with Native American tribes and with rights and with the sheer number of people who were coming across. And you can imagine this journey. You leave Missouri in May, and you walk or ride on that wagon until right about now, to mid-October or so, to arrive here. And all kinds of stuff happened. They got attacked frequently. One of their oxen died, so they had to hitch a cow up to the team. And they were attacked many times and had to defend themselves. And reports from Sarah years later said that some of the women begged to go back. Let's just turn around. This is not worth it. Our children are in great danger here. And somebody named Mrs. Tremble got right up in their faces and said, "Stop being such babies. We're not turning back. We're going forward." And we can all take a moment and imagine in our minds what Mrs. Tremble may have looked like. They arrived here in October, and like many families, they thought they would spend the winter at the Whitman Mission on the river that Marcus Whitman had founded years earlier, and was kind of a sanctuary and a destination for many of these pioneers. And they would hear from the grapevine that it was a place that you could safely stay and spend the winter before you and recover from this journey. Well, they got there, and Sarah didn't like it. There was bad vibes going on there, if we can use a modern term, and there was measles. There was a lot of death going on. There was a lot of disease. Native American hostilities were high at that point there, and she kind of gathered all that, and she insisted that they leave. So they made their way, and they found this property outside of Monmouth and homesteaded it. And 2 weeks later, the Whitman massacre occurred, and everybody, all the white people at the mission, were killed and totally wiped out. Well, they eventually raised 13 children, farmed that land, lived out their lives on that property, and they're buried in Dallas. The property passed down to 2 families, the Alsips and the Bursells, and if you drive down there now in that area, you'll end up on either Alsip or Bursell Road, because they ended up naming the roads after the people who lived there in the 50s. Big prune growing area. That whole Polk County area was huge in prunes in the 20s. In 1927, there were 750 prune orchards in Polk County that were making people a lot of money and doing well for the farmers. I started just reading up on the families and finding what I could, and just some small idyllic moments. Kenneth Bursell, as a 9-year-old kid, won a trip to San Francisco because of all the and the Bursell and Alsip kids showed up every year in the county or in the state fair for the produce that they grew and the champion-sized watermelons. Well, Kenneth, his thing was raising pigs. He raised pigs, and he wrote a paper called "How I Did It," and that paper won him the first prize and the trip to San Francisco. Well, anyway, the Bursell family continued to live on that property until Dan and Helen Duché purchased it in the early 80s, cleared it, planted it. There were like about 30 prune trees left on the property, and they eventually knocked them all down because the bees were just so intense every year. And when I went to visit them last year, there was 1 prune tree left, and I walked away with a whole bag full of them. I did meet Iris Bursell, who married one of Kenneth's sons, and they raised their kids and lived on the property for most of her adult life. And I mentioned sheep, and she shook her head and said, "Oh, we don't do sheep. We couldn't do sheep. We lost 20 sheep one night to wild dogs here on the farm, and that wiped out our sheep, and the hell with sheep." And you'd think that Iris Bursell was an unlucky person, but she won the lottery twice. Hershey Vineyard, just outside of Carlton, between Carlton and Yamhill. A beautiful property now owned by John, I think it's Linda Hershey. And again, Ken Wright claims most of the grapes from it. Well, at one time, Clarice Pearson lived on that property, or adjacent to it, or her husband's did, or did. And Clarice Herner Pearson was named after Clara Barton, who was a kind of distant relative. And her distinction, and why we're talking about here, is because she was the oldest living person in Oregon, 110 years old when she died in 2009. Wasn't on the farm at that point. She was in a nursing home. But there were stories about her, as you know, she passed 100 years and stuff that you could reference. And one of them, when she was over 100, they took her back to Carlton, where she'd grown up. And she walked around and said, oh yeah, this is where we did this and that. And she remembered the combination of the safe where she used to work 50 years earlier, which I believe is the safe at the Barrel 47 restaurant now. And I can't remember my password for Twitter. John Allen Hickman lived right near there on another vineyard property that we now know as the Savoia Vineyard. He was, when he passed away, I'm going to say 1913 or something. He was one of the last remaining Civil War veterans who lived in Yamhill County. He had survived 13 campaigns in the South after enlisting from his home in Indiana. Moved to Oregon to open a power station in Portland. He acquired the land in 1908. Oh, okay. He farmed it until 1921, and he died in 1935, which is where we see this obituary appear in the paper. He's buried here in McMinnville. And that property that he lived on is called the Savoia Vineyard. It's actually where Ken Wright lives now, and so Ken and Karen Wright own the property. And another kind of misnomer vineyard naming. It's like, why'd you call it Savoia? Well, when they were clearing the property, they found and smelled wild onions everywhere. Tons of wild onions growing in the land there. And Ken was working with his assistant winemaker Armando, and said, "How do you call those in Spanish?" He said, "Well, they're Savoia. Savoia is the word for onion in Spanish, so they didn't want to call it Savoia, so they called it Savoia." Now, just to the south of that, and back on the Hershey Vineyard, is the land that was homesteaded by Green Rowland. Jeremiah Rowland and Green Rowland came across in 1844, and were known as, you know, long-standing pioneers all through their later days. If you go, there's actually a Rowland Road right near the Belpont Vineyard right now, and there's a big commemorative plaque about Jeremiah Rowland mostly. But Green was his son, and he you know, got that land claim and lived there for the rest of his life. And some of you I know in the audience have had brushes, let's say, with the Oregonian. Well, in about 1910, Green Rowland woke up to read the paper that said, "There are a number of pioneers belonging to this early period who have not yet passed, yet will go soon." And Green Rowland was named as one of those. And so I can imagine he said, "Thanks a lot, I'm canceling my subscription." Yeah, and you know, lots of lives, of course, took place over these years on these lands, and stuff that can be documented, and people who lived here and came here for the same reasons many of us came here to find this better Oregon life. Back on the Savoia property, after J.A. Hickman passed away, a couple named William Felix and Ida Allen lived. Oh, no, those are two different families. Anyway, William Felix was from Missouri. He worked in coal mines in Idaho and Montana. Came here to start his farm, but he died young, 56 years old, from tuberculosis. So he asked his brother George to look after Ida, and George did pretty well at that because he married Ida, and they lived the rest of their lives until they had a car crash in the Long Tom River in 1954, and that was the end of that. But another person who lived on that property, the Savoya property, was named Grace Fox Trollinger. Her grandfather bought a piece of land that would become one of the most important vineyards around here. In 1866, and this is the handwritten deed, he bought 110 acres from John Abbott for $1,600, as this deed attests. And the Abbott Claim Vineyard, I don't know if you know, it's between Lafayette and Carlton. It's on an outcropping called Savannah Ridge, which is actually a very unique geological formation around here because it runs east-west instead of the usual north-south. So it has this immense south-facing and north-facing slopes and has become the home of many prominent vineyards. Soder is up there. Ken Wright, some of his most highest scoring wines came from that Abbott Claim Vineyard. And it all started with John Abbott. This is the vineyard itself. It's a beautiful property. John F. Abbott, a pretty dynamic guy. He was born in New York State in 1823. He started a stagecoach business in Wisconsin, came to California to mine gold in 1849, and quickly made his way up here to Lafayette. He started another stagecoach line. You could go from Lafayette to Portland in 2.5 days, each way, on his stage line. And he got his land claim in 1856 on that Savannah Ridge, which again is a big rolling hill. And I don't imagine John Abbott lived there or even wanted to. I don't even know if he farmed it. He just owned it, 640 acres. This is the document that grants him the land claim. And when you got a land claim, you had to have a couple neighbors vouch for you, say that, first of all, you didn't have any claim to the land, and that John F. Abbott, or whoever the claimant was, had homesteaded that land and lived on it for the last, I think, 3 years. And you were supporting his claim. This is signed by Absalom Hembry. We all know about Hembry Street here in town. Well, Absalom Hembry was quite an interesting guy. He, this document is from 1833, and 3 years later, about the time Abbott officially received the title to the land, Hembry was dead and gone because he was enlisted to lead a militia to fight Indians in the Indian Wars up on the other side of the Columbia. Was killed and scalped in Toppenish, Washington, where a monument still stands to this event. His body was returned here to Yamhill County for a hero's funeral. Postscript to this is John Abbott left the area a couple years later. He moved to Walla Walla and started another stagecoach business and farmed until he lived till 1896. A long life in the business. Well, we want to talk about farming and what it was like to own and try to make a living as a farmer. This is the Guadalupe Vineyard, which is right there on Abbey Road, and it abuts the Trappist Abbey, which is why they called it Guadalupe when Jim Stonebridge and his wife Kathleen bought it. But what I'm showing you here, which I know is probably hard to read and which I have in my hand, is a handwritten map of sorts of the vineyard that the person who sold him the land wrote for them. The Doris Ziegler was her name. And she lived her whole adult life and raised her kids with her husband Cecil on the property. And wanted to tell them, what it was like and what that farm had been. And so as we see on the top of the thing of the map, she wrote old pie cherries, prunes in the 40s, scattering of quite a few hazelnuts were harvested over the years, cherries in the middle. Here's where we grazed the stock. Filberts down here, and more prunes and more cherries, but in pasture land. But she just kind of mournfully wrote on the bottom section here, in her careful pencil hand that the prunes, kept them in business for a few years, but then just collapsed. Prune prices began to decline, wrote Doris. Cecil saw a better future in cherries, so he planted more of them. We did well in pears until the Hunt cannery left the Salem area, which hurt the prune and pear market. We couldn't but break even some years, so we took out the pears. Prunes had already been grubbed out, and they tried cherries. And then the worst storm in the history of Oregon hit, 1962. And we had some good winds here yesterday, but they didn't hold a candle to 1962. The Columbus Day storm of October 1962, 100-mile-per-hour winds flew through this valley. It was the worst, and still is the worst, extratropical storm to ever hit anywhere in the U.S. It was basically a hurricane inland. It killed 46 people, smashed a lot of stuff. It blew away farms and vineyards. This is a photo of the bell tower at Western Washington University in Monmouth collapsing that somebody caught in a remarkable picture. And you expect people to be taking selfies in the background. And they're just not there, not for a few years. But if you had a farm on October 10th, 1962, that was barely scraping by, on October 13th, you were out of business. And farms just got destroyed all through the valley. I say particularly but really everywhere. It just really changed the landscape here. And so it kind of set the stage for a dormancy period. Another 20 years went by. And now we're in the 1980s, early 90s, and we're in Ribbon Ridge. And Bryce Bagnall, who with his wife Marcia wanted to be a winemaker. He's from California, heard that Oregon was the place to come for young people who didn't have a lot of money but were willing to put in a lot of sweat equity. If you know Lynn Penner Ash, he was a classmate of hers in oenology school in California. Well, he came here, they found a property up in Ribbon Ridge. Ribbon Ridge, largely untested then. There were some vineyards happening, but it was mostly a guess, an informed guess by people that fine wine grapes would grow on these hillsides. This property that they found had actually been purchased and cleared by Donald Olson, who owned the Torrey Moore winery. He's a doctor in Portland. And I talked to him, and he said, yeah, I had to sell that land. I didn't want to, but a divorce forced my hand. And so he had to divest of it, and they bought it. It was just cleared land, and it was wildly overgrown. And Marcia Bagnall said, if you want to test a marriage, build a deer fence. Build a half-mile-long deer fence against the woods with your husband, and you'll see how hard it is. So they built their deer fence, and they planted the property, and they got it up and running. And it takes 3 years for a grapevine to produce usable fruit. And on the third year, when they collected their first harvest, Bryce Bagnall was diagnosed with ALS. And over the course of the next 2 years, he declined more and more, was unable to work, unable to do his winery. They continued cultivating it and trying to make wine over the course of a couple of years. And there's a nice aerial of that vineyard. And he passed away. His remains are entombed on the vineyard. And in fact, the label of Ken Wright's Bryce Vineyard Wine depicts that gravesite with an overturned bucket that Bryce's father-in-law had created for him. A few more minutes? How are we doing? I want to show you briefly how you find this stuff out. Where'd it go? Oh, well. If you wanted to find out for your own sake or anybody's, the histories of the properties. Not so easy to do, but there's a few guidelines that help. You could always hire me, of course. But the first thing I do is I go to the county and I ask for the tax record for that address. And here you get this tax plat map, and it shows you the tax number, and that helps a little bit to place it in time. But what you really need here is all of these maps have boundary lines for the donation land claim owners from pioneer days. And it says, this is the northwest corner of the John Marble DLC. Let's see if the next one works. And from there are these wonderful maps that you can get in the library or online by Charles Metzger from Tacoma. In 1928 and 1942, I think it was, he mapped every county in Oregon. And he didn't do it by addresses. What you see with a Metzger map is the name of the landowners penciled in a fine hand, and their property lines. And so you see that on this little piece of land, it was owned by Franklin Keyes and Laura Hardwick and all of these people who have long since come and gone. But the Metzger maps also had the DLC boundaries. So you can match that against what the county has. And you can say, oh, okay, well, the DLC line, corner's right there, and the property's right across the way. So this is the same property, and now I know that Franklin Keyes owned that property. From there, you can kind of scroll back and look for any biographical or obituary information about these names who you find, and you try to match them up and figure out the lines of succession and who owned what where. And once in a while you get lucky and you find a nice write-up on people. All right, I'm going to conclude with one thing here. The Shea Vineyard, which, as you probably know, is a very prominent vineyard outside of Carlton, owned by Dick Shea from New York, who bought it on a guess. He was an investment banker in New York City. He had a few bucks fall into his lap from a business deal, and thought, okay, I'm going to go out and buy a vineyard property in Oregon because it's cheaper to buy here than it is in Napa. And so Dick purchased a large property and planted it, and after much trial and error, Ken Wright said that the first wines that came out of the Shea Vineyard tasted like canned asparagus. Not a good thing if you've invested your whole life savings in a vineyard. Anyway, it's a very prominent vineyard now. To get some of the highest scores of all the wine press, and Dick Shea has made a fine business of it, and also created his own winery, the Shea Winery. Well, the early pioneer who claimed that land was Robert Crouch Kinney, who was possibly, besides Zach Geary, the coolest person to ever live in Oregon. He came over with his brother Samuel in 1847. They were on Captain Joel Palmer's wagon train, 100 wagons. They found this land there outside of Carlton, which I don't even know if it existed then, probably didn't, and homesteaded it. He farmed it for 10 years, but he was a entrepreneur and a pretty smart guy. He started milling flour, and he was good at it, and he started milling, and he became the biggest flour wheat miller in the West. He owned mills in Portland and Salem. He shipped flour to Europe. He controlled something like 80% of Oregon's wheat crop every year. But he was also known as just a great guy, a benefactor of McMinnville College down the street, now known as Linfield. Helped keep it afloat in its early years, and was just kind of much beloved. He died in 1875, and on the day he died, people were so grief-stricken that all the businesses closed, and people wept in the streets. 142 years ago, this is his obituary. If we picture to ourselves men of strong will, fixed principles, full of resources, mentally and physically, generous and humane, self-made and self-controlled, not only equal but superior to every emergency, able to master every trade or profession, we have the Oregon pioneers. These men are a credit to the sciences of agriculture and mechanics, to the professions, to commerce and its financial dependencies. In short, to every honorable calling. They are the men for the times and generation in which they live, and the world has no place in which she can hide such men. They are never so rich as when struggling in poverty and under adverse circumstances, and never so poor as when, after great success, they find nothing more to achieve. And I'll add the women too. When Nancy Daniel, going back to Canary Hill Vineyard, was talking about her husband Dick, who passed away a few years ago, she said Dick could drive anything. He loved driving stuff. But the thing he liked driving most was his tractor, because he could always look back and see what he'd accomplished. And I wish the same for you as you write your histories. Quick questions? Anyone? Ma'am?
Was that an original document with all the hardships written down?
Yeah.
By that gal?
Yeah, it's just on a little...
How did you get your hands on that?
She had given it to Jim Stonebridge when he bought the property. She actually wrote it, for him to explain what had happened on that land. And so he has kind of lent it to me. Anybody else? Mr. Geary.
Jim, do you see a book coming from any of this work?
Do I see a book coming from this work? No, I don't. I think this audience of 15 people here is probably the audience of the market for such a book. And if you're all willing to pay $1,000 for that book, I will gladly write it. But otherwise, I just don't know who would publish it. And these days, you read stuff online. All this material's online now. Anybody else? Mr. Geary.
Seems like history may have cycles, and you read a lot about people ripping up what was on the land to plant grapes. Do you foresee a time in which you'll be writing, or someone like you will be writing a story about when people were ripping up grapes, and what will it be then?
The question is the cycles that have appeared in this research of people planting things and ripping them out and planting other things, and do we see this happening with the grapes? And unfortunately, yeah, there's a very pronounced cycles that happen here. Prunes were huge in this valley, and people were making fortunes and building prune drying sheds everywhere they could. And prune drying sheds would burn down every year, and they build another one. And they made their livings at it, and then all of a sudden, the prune business vanished. The canneries went away, the business all went to the Philippines, so they grew cherries. And cherries did great here, and stone fruits. And somebody told me that at one point, they couldn't get the labor cost effectively to get the cherries off the trees and into the markets. And then all the canneries, again, left, made it prohibitively expensive, and so you have a whole field of cherry trees and walnuts and whatever that you have grown and sold successfully, and now they're gone. So grapes right now are in a boom here. There's a great market for fine wine, but I have lived here 10 years. We've gone from 250 wineries in Oregon to I think it's 750 now. There's more and more and more competition for the same $50 bottle of wine. They're suddenly having labor issues to work those vineyards and get that fruit to market. And they're all marketing like crazy, trying to get the same market of fine wine buyers to embrace their product. Demographically, there's a lot of young people who are coming in behind us octogenarians, and hopefully we'll continue to provide a market for wine, but beer is growing by leaps and bounds, craft beer, and it's a heck of a lot cheaper than wine. So we'll see. We'll see what our grandchildren find when they come here and find old vineyards. Anybody else? Thanks again for having me.
Well, an apt gift for our speaker today, we have a bottle of Sokol Blosser Winery from our sponsor, Sokol Blosser, to take home, and make sure it makes it home, please. Thank you all for coming to McMinnville City Club. We'll see you in January. If we don't see you on the third Tuesday, I think is the 19th in December at the Pub Chat. So thank you very much, and have a great day.